Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Los Rodriguez Pink Honey Lactic Processed Bolivia from Oasis Coffee Roasters. And there's the bag right there. And Oasis, based out of Taipei, Taiwan. And this is their second ever appearance on this channel, having previously reviewed the Papaya Tea, a wash-processed Ecuadorian coffee. And as is usually the case, when reviewing a brand new coffee roaster for the first time, I usually like to review one of their washed and one of their non-washed offerings, with this one acting as the non-washed representative. And it is kind of funny, when I did end up meeting with Airworks to retrieve this coffee, I had a bit of a surprised moment when he handed me this coffee and said that it is something that I ordered, as it does seem so out of character for me to pick up a coffee like this. But if I do recall correctly, the reason I picked this coffee out was because there weren't a lot of non-washed coffees that did interest me. And what is kind of interesting about this coffee to me in hindsight is the fact that it is a Bolivian geisha, even if it is uniquely processed. So I feel like that was probably the biggest motivating factor for me to pick up this one. So it'll certainly be interesting to see how it's turned out, as this right here is day 42. And recipe we went with for this coffee was our standard recipe, only 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 96 degrees Celsius, about 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind. Roast profile for this coffee. In our La Papaya Mejorado review, I mentioned that they had that one listed as a roast level 2. This one is listed as a roast level 1, so this one is in theory lighter than that Papaya Mejorado that we had reviewed. That being said, I still don't necessarily think their coffees are overly light. While this one may have felt slightly lighter than that coffee, it's something that we'll kind of discuss throughout this review, as it did act in a kind of interesting and weird way. So for the most part, I will say that it's still on the slightly more developed side of that light medium spectrum by most standards and metrics. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 15, first impression through the V60, and the coffee was off to a very strange start, as it looks, smells, and brews on the more developed side of things. However, the coffee itself came out surprisingly clean. There is a lot of, we'll say the varietal does a lot of heavy lifting for this one, as the profile is red but presented in a cleaner sense, so it was certainly an unusual start. So going into this one, I fully expected this coffee to be super heavy, and based off of what I saw and the aroma that I took in, I was fully expecting that to translate to the cup. However, the overall cleanliness to it was significantly higher than I might have expected given all of those circumstances, so wasn't really sure what to make of it. We'll go ahead and move on to day 18, as we opted for the Chemex, and there was a similar sentiment this time around, as every single time I brewed this coffee, I felt like it was going to turn out much more heavy than it did, as it's still surprisingly clean for what the coffee is, as the peachiness was coming through a bit more this time around as well. Additionally, a bit of citric florality and a touch of roastiness that can be felt as well. So it was an interesting mix, and that's one thing I wanted to highlight with the profile of this coffee is, in theory, this should be as light as they go with their coffees, but that's to say that they're still not necessarily overly light. Day 21 through the April brewer, and the coffee is still a bit of an anomaly, as I can't help but shake the feeling that it smells different from the way it actually presents itself. Even the profile is a bit more pink hard candy, just opposite of the listed descriptors that they do have for this coffee. Clean in a slightly generic sense with a high level of sweetness. So this coffee, for the most part, has honestly just left me stumped, because the notes on here, the way the coffee brews, the way the coffee acts, is completely different from the way that the coffee was actually turning out for me. Day 24 through the V60 with some lower extraction adjustments, and the coffee isn't as good as the previous days, as it does continue to remain surprisingly clean, but notably less intense, with less of the candied fruit qualities, better presentation of the citric florality, so a little bit more of that, but that's not necessarily something that I was going for with this coffee. We move on to day 27, as we made the same adjustments through the Chemex, and noted that the coffee continues to just remain cleaner, and it did have a bit of consistency in that sense too, as there hasn't been anything particularly unique day by day. We have some slightly more floral-like aspects at times, but for the most part it has this kind of weird generic pink candy feel to it. A little less intensity overall, and a slight bit more robustness to it, a little bit heavier, but for the most part I just felt like this probably wasn't the ideal brew method and adjustment for this coffee. Day 30 through the V60 with our standard recipe, and this is the first time the coffee had a notable lack of clarity as it's not particularly well defined, offering a slightly grainy bread and fermenting quality to the coffee with still a higher level of sweetness. So that's much more what I was expecting from this coffee, especially given the way that it was presenting itself. So that was a bit more in line with the expectations, but still not necessarily in line with a lot of the descriptors that were presented with this coffee. Day 33 through the Chemex with our standard recipe, and it's better than the previous days as it has a little less of that graininess and fermentiness, and it's a bit more similar to the earlier pink hard candy experience, but still a bit robust all around as the coffee does have a moderately high intensity to it. And I think in theory, going into something like this, what are you expecting to do the heavy lifting? Are you expecting the varietal? Are you expecting the origin? Or are you expecting the processing? Because this is such a strange mix of all three that going into it, I fully expected that the origin and the varietal were going to take a hold of this coffee, but I feel like the Gesha really did an impressive job of keeping this one cleaner and more balanced than it probably should have otherwise. Day 36 through the Chemex with our standard recipe, and the coffee does continue to be mostly pink candy-like as there's a complementary sweeter component, including an orange and even peach candied aspect to the coffee. So that's much more of what I was expecting based off the description. Citric florals as the coffee does continue to remain clean, sweet, and a bit intense. All right, so let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And for the way I've been describing this coffee, it's kind of funny that this tasting wheel looks so normal, but we'll go through this tasting wheel one by one, starting with the level 4s, and we'll start with the cleanliness level 4. That's the first takeaway, and the most notable thing about this coffee for me is it's clean. And in theory, I don't think it should be clean based off of the processing, but it did turn out clean, as I didn't get too much of a hint of fermentiness, funkiness, or anything that could really take away from the overall cleanliness. Even the, we'll say, roastier qualities were notably more toned down when compared alongside of the papaya tea mejorado that we had also reviewed from them. So take that as you will. Level 4 for cleanliness, even if it is just a bit more generic of a cleaner profile to it. Finish, level 4. And the finish is interesting because it does seem to skew a little bit more on that interesting kind of pink candy feel for the majority of the time. Outside of that, you can get some slightly peach qualities, some slightly more citric floral qualities to it, but even then, none of which is particularly, we'll say, defined or abundant throughout the majority of the time with this coffee. Sweetness, level 4. And sweetness is pretty interesting to me because this coffee probably turned out significantly more sweet than I would have expected going into it. And it's that kind of interesting hard candy sweetness to it as well. So level 4 for that, fully nothing I was expecting with this coffee. Florality, level 4. I highlighted the more generic citric floral quality to this coffee, and I could certainly see that throughout the entirety of it, and that justified its scoring a level 4, given that this coffee at times can be a little bit more of a moderate intensity than a lot of the qualities that are presented in this coffee are going to score a little bit higher, as is the case with all of the fruit qualities that we are scoring there at the level 4s. So we'll start with the berry fruit, level 4. And I feel like the best thing I can say about the berry fruit is whatever that pink hard candy feel is, it does feel a little bit more along the lines of a berry pink hard candy. So maybe something along the lines of like a strawberry or a raspberry in that sense. So that's what's scoring there at the level 4. Citrus fruit, level 4. I mentioned that there's a bit more generic of a citric floral quality to it, but that also does translate into the citrus, which is scoring there. Stone fruit, level 4. They do have a stone fruit note list on here, so I can see that with this coffee as well. And I could certainly see a little bit of that peachy-like aspect to it. Going back to that berry fruit, I can also see a slight bit of the red berries in terms of the fermentiness, even though it wasn't necessarily overly pronounced for the majority of it. And then one level 3, actually, just the acidity level 3, or 2 level 3s. Yeah. The acidity, not necessarily the brightest coffee, though, given the profile of this one and given the varietal, I don't think it was ever intended to be the brightest coffee. Caramel level 3, that is entirely attributed to the candied-like aspect of this coffee. And then the final thing worth discussing is the body at that level 2, so lighter bodied coffee, so that's probably the Gesha at play once again. But outside of that, even though this is a very normal looking tasting wheel, I do think it is a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. It's rare that I'm this stumped by a coffee because I did not expect this coffee to turn out the way that it did whatsoever. If this coffee would have turned out just very fermenty, then I would have been fine with that, mostly because it's what I was expecting. And if this coffee would have at least turned out a lot more in line with the profile that they do have described for this coffee, then I could also see that. But the fact that this coffee just turned out so different from what the coffee is labeled as or the way that I was expecting this coffee to turn out just made this one a very unique experience. And I think it's primarily the cleanliness, because on paper and in theory, this coffee should not be anywhere near as clean as it is, but it was. And as a result, it just changed the way that this coffee did turn out for me. I don't think I was necessarily the biggest fan of this coffee. Truth be told, I probably enjoyed the papaya tea a little bit more than this one, mostly because that one did have a bit more of some sweeter qualities. And even though this one was cleaner, it just didn't necessarily offer something that I would have enjoyed too much throughout this coffee. The pink candy was kind of interesting, but at times it could have been ever fleeting, as this coffee just at times felt a little generic for me. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to. It's another really interesting suggestion and recommendation when it comes to this coffee roaster, because this coffee roaster is just a little unique and different relative to coffees that I've had like this, though it's not too common to find a lot of Bolivian geishas that have this unique processing to them. That being said, it's very clean. First place, I should probably start with that. And then it offers some unique, we'll say candied aspects to it, some unique floral qualities to it. That citric florality was also a little different from what you might expect, while at the same time still having some fruit-like depth to it in that stone fruit sense. So that's probably the best direction I can point somebody towards on this one, and also the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Los Rodriguez Pink Lactic Honey Processed Bolivia from Oasis Coffee Roasters. Thank you for watching.